Hello, welcome to Radical Engagements here at Varn blog, and today we talk about Adam Przeworski's relatively recent, which is crazy because the man is 84 years old, article, Who Decides What is Democratic? Adam Przeworski was born in 1940. He was one of the original school of analytic Marxists, part of the September group. He joined either in 1979 or 1980 and stayed until 1995. His recent work, at least for the last decade or two, have not so much been on analytic Marxism, but on social democracy and democracy. He's influential for including game theory and rational choice theory into his social democratic works, highly influenced by John Elster and the Austrian economist slash his frenemy of the German historical school, Joseph Schopenhauer, and of course the analytical Marxist interpretation of Karl Marx. I think he is currently professor emeritus at NYU. And as his name would indicate by its very interesting spelling, he's Polish. All right, let's get into this article. This article can be found for free online, but it was published in volume 35, issue 3 of the Journal of Democracy in July of last year. And we start off with Marine Le Pen being all Le Pen-y and a bunch of French flags as the title banner. The abstract is very brief. What is democratic depends on the values one attaches to democracy. The distinction that determines the answer is between the minimalist and maximalist conceptions of democracy. Defending democracy requires a positive, forward-looking program of reform. Let's see what Przeworski says now that he is no longer all that associated with Marxism. What are we defending when we defend democracy? That's a good question. I wonder that a lot myself, since a lot of times defending democracy seems like defending the democratic state's administrative apparatus or its judicial core or the rule of law or the executive branch, etc. The distinction that organizes the answer to the questions between democracy as a method for processing whatever conflicts may arise in a particular society and democracy as an embodiment of values, ideas, or interests that the different groups of people want democracy to realize. This distinction between the minimalist, or methodological, and maximalist, or ideological, populist, ideal, conceptual, conceptions of democracy, where by conception I mean definition that has a normative connotations, which all definitions of democracy have. So yeah, I mean, there's a contestations of values in the idea and terminology around democracy itself. When you ask someone to defend democracy, what are the relevant elements that are democratic and why do you care? Those are questions you have to ask. Democracy is a system in which citizens collectively decide by whom and to what extent how they will be governed. This feature is definitional. A regime is democratic if and only if people are free to choose, including remove governments. So we are still accepting democracy as representational here, but there has to be a way to remove and deal with the governments and to shift governments as need be. In the minimalist conception, this is all there is to democracy. As long as all the prerequisites for citizens to freely choose governments are met and the political decisions are made according to the established procedures, whatever the voters decide is democratic. True, voters decide only indirectly by electing legislatures. Laws are adopted by legislatures, not voters. But if legislature is freely elected and follows the procedure in promulgating laws, and if the laws are duly executed, democracy is not questionable, at least in the minimal conception. In this conception, the value of democracy is intrinsic. It is the very capacity of the citizenry as a collectivity to choose governments. Yet this capacity is not ready-made. It does require prerequisites. Already, John Stuart Mill thought that the two elements of democracies are high wages and universal reading. That's interesting. Democracy is a system of positive rights, but it does not automatically generate the conditions necessary for exercising those rights. As Tom Ginsburg and Aziz Hug, I think, observe, for general electoral competition to be sustained, something more than bare minimum of legal and institutional arrangements is necessary. In addition, there's a need for the civil and political rights employed in the democratic process, the availability of a neutral electoral machinery, and the stability, predictability, and publicity of the legal regime usually captured in the term rule of law. To this extent, therefore, the conception that reduces democracy to free and fair elections, sometimes criticized as electoralism, is not so minimal. While minimalist criterion is conceptually clear, operational disagreements do arise. It is sufficient to see how different researchers have classified Russia and Venezuela over the past 30 years. Particularly slippery are the measures that Osen Varol classifies as stealth. These are seemingly democratic actions that are meant to increase an incumbent's electoral advantage. For example, both Italy's Silvio Berlusconi and Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan have made it possible, or in the Turkish case easier, for citizens residing abroad to vote in national elections. Each couched his actions in democratic language about extending political right to all citizens, but the obvious motive in both cases was to gain votes. Only after the fact did it become clear that Berlusconi had shot himself in the foot, while Turks in Germany proved to be reliable voters for Erdogan and his party. Such measures are difficult to assess using minimalist criteria either before the fact by motives or after by results. Hence, controversies about measuring democracy abound. Just see the recent special issue of PS Political Science and Politics on democratic backsliding. In the maximalist conceptions, democracy is a method for realizing certain extrinsic values. As Jopen Schumpeter observed, most people value democracy not per se, but because they hope it will realize some superior values, ideas, or interests that they find desirable. Schumpeter gives the example, but does not reduce the list to a fixed set of items. This is a Schumpeter quote. There are ultimate ideals and interests which the most ardent Democrats will put above democracy. And all he means, if he professes uncompromising allegiance to it, is that he feels convinced that democracy will guarantee these ideals and interests, such as freedom of conscience and speech, justice, decent government, and so on. Indeed, almost all normatively desirable aspects of political life, and sometimes even of social and economic life, are credited to democracy. Representation, accountability, equality, participation, justice, dignity, rationality, and security, the list goes on. We repeatedly hear that unless democracy is X or generates X, then ellipses. The ellipses is rarely spelled out, but it insinuates a system in which governments are elected is nonetheless not a democracy unless X is fulfilled. Obviously, the more values one attaches to democracy, the less prone one is to find it. Moreover, as their lists indicate, the values that people attach to democracy may differ. This is what I refer to maximalisms in plural. Most importantly, whether people differ about the values or interests they desire democracy to realize, maximalist conceptions generate conflicts. True, as Louis Coster emphasizes, these conflicts may be cross-cutting. They need not pit class against class or religion against religion. They may be attenuated by an overlapping consensus regarding the practicalities that is compatible with differences over values. The conflicts may also be moderated by public discussions at both the normative and technical levels. Yet in the end, when all coalitions have formed, the outlines of practical consensus have taken shape, and the arguments have reached their close, conflicts remain. The question is then, is what we are defending when we defend the intrinsic value that we attach to democracy, say justice or economic equality? Are we defending democracy itself or the values that we attach to it? And what is the answer to the question when different people attach different values to democracy? Seems to be a very relevant question today, particularly in the West. The difficulty. The difficulty today is that everyone is a Democrat. Fascism and communism are rationally motivated, elaborate, and broadly appealing alternatives to democracy, although both included democratic elements. This is Varn adding that. So while the epithet fascist is carelessly thrown around these days, fascism is dead. Not all the ideas attached to it, but actual fascistic countries do not really exist anymore, at least not too many of them. In contrast to the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China does not seek to propagate its political system to other countries. Democratic rhetoric is used to cross the entire political spectrum. For example, Putin propagandist Mikhail Leontiev declares, I do not understand what is undemocratic in the fact that some force which enjoys an overwhelming social support wins elections. Donald Trump claims that, quote, our movement is about replacing a failed and corrupt, and now when I say corrupt, I'm talking about totally corrupt political establishment with a new government controlled by you, the American people. The Sweden Democrats, a party with authentically fascist roots, now declares its commitment to democracy. So does the Freedom Party of Austria, as well as the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and her Brothers of Italy party. Jose Antonio Cast, the right-wing politician who lost the December 2021 Chilean presidential runoff to the leftist Gabriel Boric, congratulated his rival and tweeted that he deserved, quote, all our respect and constructive collaboration, unquote. Now, Putin did adopt both overt and covert measures to make his removal from office impossible. Trump tried, but was too incompetent to make them effective. Such attempts are anti-democratic by the minimalist criterion. But Meloni, the Sweden Democrats, and the Freedom Party of Austria have governed without undertaking any measures that would violate the minimalist norms. The Western European, quote, extreme right appeals vaguely to traditional values and is programmatically anti-European immigration, anti-immigration, anti-Islam, and anti-crime, but represents preconditions for democracy. Even more, the West European right has generally swayed away from cultural issues while rightist parties vary in their positions on economic issues. In Eastern Europe, cultural issues are more prominent, with several homophobic and anti-gender equality policies having been adopted. In this respect, Republicans in the United States are closer to the right-of-center counterparts in Eastern rather than Western Europe. Whether the policies of the Polish government run by the Law and Justice Party, anti-abortion, anti-LGBTQ, against signing a treaty to combat domestic violence, anti-democratic, such policies violate norms of universalism, equality, or freedom, which many see as essential to democracy. These policies won the support of a voting majority in reasonably free elections. The French Parliament just adopted an immigration law that says next to nothing about cross-border people flows, but severely restricts the rights of non-citizens who are already in the country, including children born in France. The legislation is clearly racist, but upwards of 70% of the French survey respondents support it. I find it repulsive, but is it anti-democratic? Przeworski is clearly implying, not technically. When values that different people respectively attach to democracy come into conflict with one another, who decides what is or is not democratic? Courts play an important role in supervising the preconditions for a free election of the collective will by seeing to it that the rules governing the elections are observed. Judges, therefore, are guardians of democracy in the minimalist sense. But maximalists can appeal to the constitutionalism to claim that even if the prerequisites for the minimum conception are satisfied, democracy is not implementing the values that it should. Constitutions embody the maximalism in the sense that they specify certain values which no transcendent majority may violate. The preamble to the U.S. Constitution mentions not only justice, but domestic tranquility and general welfare. The preamble to the Constitution of India refers, with capital letters in the original, to justice, social, economic, and political, liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship, equality of status and of opportunity, and to promote them all fraternity, assuring the dignity of the individual and the unity and integrity of the nation. Liberty, equality, fraternity. I'll go back to the French Revolution with justice added in for good measure. Maximalists can claim that violations of these norms by temporary majorities may be democratic, but they are not constitutional. Constitutional review bodies exist, both inside and outside legislatures, to help appeals to the values enshrined in constitutions. The premise that the will of the people resides in the Constitution rather than in some transient majority. But if courts are silent or confer majority decisions, in many cases because the incumbent government has packed the bench, and in response to some people continue to insist that these decisions violate the values they attach to democracy, what do? We can't just claim we're defending democracy all the time when we don't agree with what democracy is. Crisis of democracy. The past 3 decades witnessed a rise of dissatisfaction with traditional representative institution, an erosion and fragmentation of the traditional party system, and a rise of extreme rightist parties, and the emergence of political magicians in the form of individuals or parties who offer miraculous solutions. We might call them demagogues. These transformations has led to a widespread concern about the future of democracy, embodied in innumerable books and articles that sound the alarm about the crisis of democracy. I wrote one of these books. This essay may constitute my second thoughts. Do these transformations pose a threat to democracy or represent an advancement of democracy? And the latter would make people uncomfortable, I think, I add myself. The intense and widespread dissatisfaction with representative institutions is often decried as populism. The validity of the criticisms of representative institutions is manifest. They are increasingly anti-democratic, and they're more and more administrative, and the administrative is professionalized and is removed from the realm of political and thus democratic oversight. That's one of the problems. Even if that administrative oversight was created by the democratic institutions through legitimate voting and by the popular will. This is why I talk so much about complexity. But anyway, I'll come back to this. It is disingenuous to complain about the widespread rejection of these institutions and at the same time bemoan persisting inequality. Inequality offers prima facie evidence that representative institutions do not function well. Cough, cough. As both the populist left and the populist right found out, the populist left investment in institutions that manifestly oversaw the unequal conditions the populist left was supposedly fighting against really made it hard for them to argue that they were actually going to do anything about them. That's legitimate. It's a legitimate complaint at the center left. Anyway, back to Przeworski. Since the 17th century, people at both extremes of the political spectrum, those for whom equity was a promise as well as those who saw it as a threat, believed that democracy, specifically universal suffrage, would generate equality in the economic and social realm. See Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer's whole major book is about that. This belief is still enshrined in the workhouses of contemporary political economy, the median voter model. Yet in New York City, there are about 100,000 school children who have no permanent residence, McKinney-Vento homeless. And in the same city, I once overheard a very rich person ask how many houses he owned, to which answer he said 14, one of which is a family compound. If our representative institutions function well, this would not have been possible. Maybe Polybius is right after all. Something that gets laughed out of the park when people mention it, and yet the patterns Polybius described definitely can be seen in America and in Western Europe. Populism comes in at least 2 varieties, participatory and delegative. Participatory populism is the demand to govern ourselves, which is what I actually support myself. I wouldn't call it populism. I'm a participatory workerist, but, nonetheless. Delegated populism is a demand to be governed well by others. I'd take that too, if we could recall them. I don't think it's ideal, but I'd accept it. As a political phenomenon, the first variety is salutary but largely inconsequential. The second is dangerous for democracy, as democracy is understood in the minimalist sense. The agenda of participatory populism consists of institutional reforms that would make louder the voice of the people. Some proposals return to the demands that the U.S. anti-federalists were already expressing in 1789. Short terms for elected officials, term limits. I am actually of two minds on term limits. I'll come back to that. The ability of voters to recall officials before their terms are over. I do support that, even if it's abused. Pay cuts for legislatures. I'm mixed on that too. And limits on circulation between public and private employment. I would be pro that. An innovation from Brazil, and one that has received worldwide attention, is participatory budgeting. Other proposals range from an inane survey democracy that the Italian five-star movement advocates to increased reliance on popular initiative referendums and randomly selecting assemblies of citizens charged with pondering proposed laws without having the authority to adopt them. Basically sortition plebiscites, which I actually would support. And I'd actually maybe even give them the ability to pass laws. All right. Yet all these measures are merely palliatives. Yep, they are. Whether I support them as reforms or not, they're not really what I'm even aiming for, right? Either democratically or as part of my overall political economic philosophy. I'm far more radical than that. They restore some confidence in democratic institutions, yet all such measures hurl themselves against the inescapable facts that each of us must be ruled by someone else, and being ruled must entail policies and laws that some people do not like. Every conceivable decision is going to displease somebody, and even if it is a decision made with the full, equal, and effective participation of the citizens. This is the rational core of the minimum of democratic centralism is just democracy argument, because there is some truth to it here. If you can opt out and still participate from within when you don't like the results of a democratic decision, is there a thing as a democratic decision because it's not particularly binding? I do believe that people should be more able to opt out, but that would require more ability to move around. All right. There is no such thing as the people in the singular, and the people in the plural have different interests, values, and norms. Yeah, the people in the singular is always imaginary. The collective is always imaginary. That's something that you have to remember. It's constructed. It might be constructed by the people themselves, but it's a constructed imaginary. Moreover, it is true that the people want to govern by themselves. Obviously, some obviously do. Otherwise, we'd have no politician, but do most or even many. A lot of people don't want to be in the government all the time. It's just true. The alternative to governing by ourselves is to be governed by others, but being governed well. What people want most is to be governed by governments which deliver whatever the populace wants, whether income, growth, promotion of certain ideological values, or whatnot. Delegated populism occurs when people want the government to govern, even when it dismantles constraints on the continuance in office and discretionary authority. The result is democratic backsliding, also known as deconsolidation, erosion, or retrogression. Ginsburg and Herb described this as a process of incremental but ultimately still substantial decay in three basic predicates of democracy: competitive elections, liberal rights to speech and association, and rule of law, because there's very little checks on the public will. I think this is interesting because democratic backsliding is an interesting problem, but I'm actually more worried about de-democratization and democratic institutions, which have also accelerated. See the EU for an example. The EU is even more professionalized than a lot of the American state bureaucracy, removing a lot of decisions from the populace and making government basically administrative in a lot of ways. And the EU Parliament doesn't really do that much. As this process advances, the opposition becomes unstable to win elections or assume office if it does win. And established institutions lose the capacity to control the executive. This is a problem. This is why Bonapartism emerges so much. And the manifestations of popular protest are repressed by force. The dangers of delegated populism is the majority of the people will support a government that delivers them what the majority wants, even when that government is subverting democratic institutions. It's a short-term fix. Is basically what the issue is, because eventually it'll subvert democratic institutions to the point in its attempt to simplify things. And when I talk about this in terms of complexity, this is what I mean. That it will undo the responsiveness to the will of the majority, even though it's that very need to undo all the checks and balances that make it democratically responsive in the first place. It eventually undoes the things that tether it to popular will. You can see how this is an issue. In turn, the decline of older parties and the rise of new ones is not anti-democratic by any criterion. Traditional party systems have eroded and become factionalized. Across the political system of Western Europe, the average number of effective parties rose from 3 in the 1970s to 4 in 2020. The number rose in Latin America as well. And I think in the United States, we still have the only 2 parties, but there are more factions within them. And I think that needs to be acknowledged. Even though those factions are not particularly powerful because of entrenched power interests within those parties. But this means that voters have more choice and are being offered alternatives closer to their preferences, things that people do value. And at the same time, the rise in the number of parties seems to not have a negative consequence. The rise of extreme rightist parties is not anti-democratic. Hate to tell you guys, but Przeworski is right. The fear of the extreme right is justifiably fed by the worry that these parties might try to undermine democracy. Yet, so long as these parties refrain from trying to undermine the possibility of their being removed from office, and so as long as they observe the institutional rules that control policymaking, their participation in governments is not anti-democratic. Sorry, liberals. The emergence of political magicians is also not anti-democratic. This is actually a point made in ancient Athens. Fucking Aristotle talked about it. It shows that when people become fed up with established alternatives, they're willing to take the risk of embracing untried solutions. When I studied elections that led to major shifts in policy paradigms, the essential power of social democrats in Sweden in 1932 and of neoliberalism in the United Kingdom and the United States in 1979 and 1980, respectively, I assumed that voters would only support a party proposing something unprecedented if that party could claim a record of responsibility, meaning that it had been in office before and had acted like all other parties while holding office. Yet the victories of Trump, Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro, and Argentina's Javier Milei show that when people are desperate, they're willing to seek any remedies and grasp at straws, even those offered by charlatans who sell miracle cures. As a Rio de Janeiro Uber driver told an interviewer, "You see this decay, this moral crisis, these politicians who steal and don't do anything for us? I am looking at voting for someone completely new." When people have nothing to lose, they embrace all kinds of delusions, like curing diseases by applying college cheese or making gold from base metals in Weimar Germany. Trump's "Make America Great Again" campaign slogan was no more than that. So was Bolsonaro's "Clean Government, Jobs, and Guns." So was Milei's "Viva la Libertad, Carajo." So is the "Expelling Immigrants," the battle cry of Europe's far-right parties and America's right parties. This is what we did not anticipate when we believed their victories unthinkable. In sum, the rejection of representative institutions does present a conundrum. We cannot pretend that these institutions are functioning well, but the solutions are not obvious and some are dangerous to democracy. In turn, neither the proliferation of parties, nor the rise of the extreme right, nor the emergence of magicians, demagogues, constitutes a threat to democracy in the minimalist sense, always with the same caveat that these democracies stay away from backsliding. Defending democracy. Declaring the advent of democracy in post-Franco Spain, Prime Minister Adolfo Suarez proclaimed that henceforth the future is not written because only the people can write it. He hoped for a better world, and I took him at his word. But people can write whatever they want. Democracy does not guarantee anything other than it is the people who write the future. It is just a terrain on which something equal and somewhat free people struggle for the realization of conflicting ideas, values, and interests. The only miracle of democracy is that these conflicts can be managed without repression and in peace. And even that's a big maybe. Me adding that, because democracies have violent outbursts historically, particularly here in the United States, but like all over the place. When people disagree about which values democracy should strive for in face of increasing polarization, democracy can be defended only as the best method for managing these disagreements. If the methods are hard to defend without reference to the purposes they are intended to serve. As Eric Ngangerspitz observed, there is something deeply disturbing in the idea that a purely mechanical, content-free producer could determine what we should do. Yet the very procedure of choosing governments by election has its merits that stand on their own. One of these merits is precaution. Matthew Graham and Milan Slolik have gathered evidence suggesting that people may be willing to tolerate transgressions of democratic norms and procedures in exchange for some material and symbolic outcome they value. When incumbents undermine democracy, their supporters face a trade-off. They can keep the competent but norm-violating current government in office at a cost to the ability to remove it in the future, or they can protect democracy now at the cost of policy outcomes they are receiving. The frequent claim is democracy is at stake is accurate if the governments are threatening to entrench themselves in office, whatever might be the people's will. But I'm going to say this, the Democrats are also threatening to remove their only alternative from them in a lot of ways. It was like protect democracy by giving yourself only one choice, which the other side does too. So what's the point here? When you have, these problems, it doesn't seem very easy to fix this way. The second virtue is the pacification of political life. Democratic method of processing conflicts by free election is the only way to manage conflicts without recourse to violence. And like I said, I don't think that always works. In Norberto Bobbio's words, what is democracy other than a set of rules for the solution of conflicts without bloodshed, or with minimal bloodshed anyway? There's implied bloodshed in a state, period, but still. Elections are not the only mechanism for processing conflicts, so are judicial and collective bargaining systems. Elections are unique, however, in that participation in them is open to all citizens. Elections may generate outcomes that the majority finds repulsive, but that a minority finds repulsive. But Democrats must be prepared to face defeats, even if their values are at stake. The virtue of a democratic method is that, so long as democracy is preserved, defeats are always temporary. But for many people in the United States, the election of 2000 was a disaster, but they knew there would be another in 2004. When the 2004 election turned out even worse, they could still hope for 2008. And perhaps unbelievably, the country that once elected and re-elected George W. Bush and Dick Cheney then elected Barack Obama in 2008. Democracy survives when the winners do not abuse their power, but also when the losers are willing to wait. This is the magic of the democratic method. What if people knowingly support anti-democratic governments? The question of whether democratic governments have the right to repress anti-democratic movements is not new. The German Federal Republic banned the Communist Party on these grounds. Yeah, bullshit, but yeah, I remember that. In Algeria in early 1992, the second round of parliamentary elections, the first multi-party contest to be held since the winning of independence from France 3 decades earlier, was called off because Islamists appeared likely to win. What if the people follow leaders who promise to empower them and then usurp power, depriving the people of the capacity to remove them? Vote for me, you'll never have to vote again. To put it as sharply as I can, what if people vote against democracy? The Constitution is not supposed to be a suicide pact, but who is to decide that we are committing suicide? The specter that incumbents may undermine the electoral mechanism is ever present. Hence, vigilance in defense of democracy in the minimalist sense is a never-ending task. But defending democracy requires more than opposing whatever the government is doing. You can't just be negative. The opposition must be more than an expression of ire. Defending democracy requires a positive, future-oriented program to reform it. This is not an easy task. Being against something unites, while being for something divides. Negative partisanship unites people. Positive partisanship makes their values more obviously not unified. This is a paradox, but it's an obvious one. Anyway, back to Przeworski. When different groups opposing violations of democratic norms attack different values to democracy, the rejection of backsliding may command the majority support, while any given proposal for reform attracts only a minority. The best evidence for this is that in many countries, the opposition cannot unite against a common enemy. The classic example is Mexico, under the rule of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the Party of Revolution Institucional, from 1934 to 2000. The hegemonic PRI had both a left and right critics, but the wings were too far apart ideologically to ever form a united front. This is also true with the Christian Democrats in Italy. Minimalism unites, maximalism divides. Backsliding governments often win elections with a majority of the popular vote. Erdogan's party, the AKP, has never won a majority of the votes in parliamentary elections, yet it has been reelected repeatedly. In Poland, the PIS won re-election in 2019 with 43.6% of the vote, but lost in 2023, with several opposition parties succeeding in forming a coalition. Crucially, the parties forming the alliance agreed not to confront the major issues that divided them: abortion. They agreed that defending democracy was more important than whatever values divided them, and that the conflicts over abortion would be managed once the victory over PIS was secured. That's the United Front, by the way. That's what it means. That's not the Marxist United Front, but it's the United Front. Hence, both opponents and supporters of the freedom of choice could promise their representative elections that they would promote their values if democracy was restored, while claiming the immediate task was to restore it. The lesson of the Polish experience, I think, is that opposition to backsliding governments can unite if they agree on relying on the democratic method to process over conflicts over maximalist values. The danger, however, is that unless representative institutions are reformed, democracy will produce the conditions that allow the anti-democratic forces to become successful in the first place. See my talking on all this complexity stuff, why I talk about it so much. Here I stand with cast mud. Populism is a symptom of a malfunctioning liberal democracy. It's not the populist fault, it is malfunctioning. It's the liberal democracy's fault. The achievement of restoring democracy is not sufficient to restore confidence in representative institutions. In my view, the main culprit behind the widespread dissatisfaction with representative institutions is that the political inequity generated by the influence of money over politics, and by the inequity of money in the first place. But others may differ. Moreover, the directions in which reforms can feasibly move will vary with circumstances. My conclusion is that to give clashing political forces renewed confidence in democratic methods, democracy's defenders must offer a forward-looking perspective that seeks to improve representative institutions, not just this is Varn adding this, not just making excuses for the status quo or trying to gaslight people that the status quo is good and that we should just return to normal, which tends to actually help the upper center strata anyway, who see the current situation as in their interest. This is a lot for us to think about and not the normal thing I talk about here. I'm often talking about political economy. This is straight up politics. But I found a lot of the "we're going to save democracy" talk to be utterly confused. After all, if saving democracy is voting for one party over and over again, there's really not a democratic choice in the first place. We'll see what can be done. Take care, like and subscribe, hit the bell, and think about your future and protect your peace.